Picture this. It's a hot August afternoon in 2003. And then, just like that, the lights go out. I'm not talking about in just one city, but across 8 US states and a huge chunk of Canada. The complex machine we all depend on, it just stopped. All right, so today we are going to break down one of the biggest infrastructure failures in modern history. We're going to dig into the official reports to really understand what went wrong. So let's get into it. How could a system that's built for reliability, with all these layers of safeguards, just suddenly collapse into total chaos? I mean, we're talking about 55 million people plunged into darkness in just a matter of minutes. This was no minor brownout. This was a complete catastrophic failure. At the time, it was actually the second most widespread blackout in history. It stretched all the way from Michigan to New York and way up into Ontario. You gotta imagine the scene. This thing just cascaded across major cities, paralyzing, well, everything. Subways just ground to a halt, trapping people underground. Airports went dark. Traffic lights died, causing instant, massive gridlock. This was so much more than an inconvenience. It was a total systemic shutdown. Now, here's what's so wild about this whole thing. It didn't happen because of some huge event, like a lightning strike or a terrorist attack. Nope. It grew from a few small, kind of unrelated problems that were just simmering below the surface on what was otherwise a totally normal summer day. So first, we got to understand the beast we're dealing with here. The power grid isn't just one thing. It's this massively interconnected machine where supply and demand have to be in perfect balance every single second of every day. And power, it flows like water. It just takes all the available paths of least resistance. That means operators can't just, send electricity down one specific wire. They have to manage the whole system as one giant organism. Okay, now let's talk about something called reactive power. I know it sounds a little technical, but stick with me because it is absolutely key to this story. Think of it as the unseen energy that things with motors need, like the millions of air conditioners that were blasting away on that hot August day. Now, unlike the real power that does the actual work, reactive power doesn't travel very well. It has to be generated close to where it's being used. And if you don't have enough of it locally, your voltage starts to drop, and that puts a serious strain on the whole system. And this is crucial. Grid operators have these incredible tools to try and stay ahead of disaster. The main one is basically a what-if machine. It's constantly running simulations. What if this generator fails? What if that power line trips? The whole point is to make sure that the worst single failure won't bring down the whole house of cards. This thing is literally the bedrock of grid reliability. So on August 14th, that whole system of checks and balances, it just started to break down. The very people who were supposed to be watching for these problems, the operators in the control rooms, well, they were unknowingly flying completely blind. The groundwork for this disaster wasn't laid by some single massive blow. It was a combination of 3 key events. And here's the thing. On their own, none of these would have been a big deal. But together, they created the absolute perfect storm. Okay, so the first domino falls at 1:31 p.m. A power plant in East Lake, Ohio, a really important local source of that reactive power we just talked about, it goes down. At the exact same time, the regional grid operator's main diagnostic tool went offline. This meant their what-if machine was totally useless. But the most critical failure, the one that turned this from a local problem into a full-blown disaster, was what happened next. And this is where things get really crazy. A software bug, something called a race condition, silently disabled the alarms in the first energy control room. This fantastic analogy from practical engineering really paints the picture. The system was still collecting all the data about failing lines and voltage drops, but the software that was supposed to scream for an operator's attention, it was just stuck in an infinite loop, showing them absolutely nothing. So just imagine this. You got operators getting frantic phone calls from other utilities saying, "Hey, your lines are tripping," but on their own screens, everything looks perfectly fine. They were completely in the dark. Their screens were only refreshing once a minute instead of every few seconds. It was impossible to confirm the crisis that was literally unfolding right under their noses. So, with the system totally vulnerable and the operators completely unaware, all it took was a few overgrown trees to start the chain reaction that would bring down the entire grid. Yeah, it's pretty simple physics, really. The more electricity you push through a wire, the hotter it gets. The hotter it gets, the more the metal expands, and the more the line sags down between the towers. And if it sags too far, well, it can touch something below, like a tree that someone was supposed to have trimmed. At 3:05 p.m., it happened. A major 345,000-volt line sagged right into an overgrown tree and short-circuited. Zap! The protective systems did their job and tripped it offline instantly. All that power it was carrying had to go somewhere else, so it jumped over to other lines, jacking up their load. And in the control room, the operators saw nothing, no alarm. About a half hour later, another key line, now carrying extra load and sagging even more in the heat, did the exact same thing. It hit a tree and tripped offline. The strain on the system is getting worse and worse, and still, not a single alarm goes off in that control room. Then, less than 10 minutes after that, a third major line, now severely overloaded from the first two failures, sags into a tree and trips. Boom. 3 critical arteries into the Cleveland area were now gone. And the operators? They were just starting to figure out something was, quote, seriously sick, but by then, it was already way too late. And right here, you can see the final, breathtaking collapse. At 4:05 p.m., the last major line into Cleveland gives up. With nowhere left to go, power starts surging wildly around Lake Erie. All across the region, protective relays, the devices designed to stop equipment from being destroyed, they see these surges as a catastrophic failure, so they start tripping lines and shutting down generators everywhere to protect themselves. In just over 7 minutes, the whole system just unraveled. The fallout was just immediate and immense. Millions of lives were thrown into chaos, and the economic toll was just staggering. The question on everyone's mind was, how in the world did this happen, and how do we make sure it never, ever happens again? I mean, the total economic hit was just mind-boggling, estimated at over $10 billion. It hammered everything from manufacturing plants to corner stores. But beyond all the dollar signs, there was a very real human cost. It's believed the blackout contributed to nearly 100 deaths. And these weren't from the outage itself, but from the consequences. Things like traffic accidents on unlit roads, fires from people using candles for light, and the failure of critical medical equipment that just had to have electricity. So, what do we actually learn from all this? Well, the joint U.S.-Canada investigation really boiled it down to 4 main causes. It put a lot of blame on the utility, First Energy, for not assessing its own system's weaknesses and, of course, for not trimming the trees. But it also pointed to a much bigger systemic failure by the organizations that were supposed to be providing oversight in the first place. Look, the 2003 blackout was a massive wake-up call. It led to brand new laws creating mandatory enforceable reliability standards for the first time. But the big question, the one we all want to know, is, are we safe from this happening again? The final report had 46 recommendations, and that led to some major changes. You can see here we've made some real progress. There's now mandatory tree trimming, way better grid monitoring tools, and standards that actually have teeth. But the story doesn't end there. The grid today faces new, and you could argue even more complex challenges. The relentless strain from extreme weather, the constant threat of cyber attacks, and the tricky business of integrating unpredictable energy sources like wind and solar. At the end of the day, the 2003 blackout wasn't just a story about trees and software bugs. It was this incredibly powerful lesson in hidden vulnerabilities. It proved that in a system this complex, tiny, invisible failures can team up to create a total catastrophe. It's a reminder that behind that simple flick of a light switch is this incredibly intricate machine that requires constant, unending vigilance to keep our modern world running. So I'm really curious, what do you think is the single biggest threat to the grid today? Is it extreme weather? Is it cyber warfare? Or maybe it's something that we haven't even really thought of yet? Let us know what you think down in the comments. Thanks for watching.